Hi, everybody. Our first speaker up today is it Carrie or Mark?
It is going to be
It's Carrie.
Carrie. Let me
Yeah.
just jump through.
Yeah.
So how many years have I known you, Carrie?
A long time. I started working with the city 20 years ago.
Yeah.
I know that it wasn't before I worked for the city of New Orleans that we met. I
Yeah.
was a little tiny baby grad student then.
I read your bio that you did a degree at UF, is that right?
Yes.
So you've been with the city for 20 plus years. You began just before Katrina, and I'm sure you'll talk a little bit about Katrina today. You are the current assistant director.
Yeah.
And so you pioneered molecular methods, which Mark, I'm sure we'll talk about in the next hour.
Mhm.
Your current responsibilities are leadership and budget management, in addition to all your science duties. So I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to you, Carrie, and the floor is yours.
Okay, great. I'm going to go ahead and share my screen.
Okay, if it gives you any message there, just go ahead and click right through it.
Okay, I'm clicking. Oh, there we go. Now I'm sharing. Okay, you can see that screen okay?
Sure can. It's looking perfect, Carrie.
Okay, wonderful, wonderful. Okay, so today I am actually, first of all, I should say I'm so excited to be a part of today's webinar, and I want to thank Dan and Rich for the invitation to be here with everybody today. But I am going to have some fun telling the story of Formosan termites in New Orleans. So it's going to be a little bit of a history lesson on how this invasive species took hold in New Orleans and some efforts that were made to help mitigate that, and really kind of where we are now with dealing with these termites in the city. Okay, so Formosan subterranean termites were imported to the city after the end of World War II. So there were infested wood crates and pallets in Southeast China coming back after the war. Now we have not just a major port city here, but several military installations, especially at that time. On this map, you can see the ones highlighted in red. You have the Camp Leroy Johnson, you have where the Lakefront Airport is, and also in Algiers, some military installations. So you have all these ships coming back with infested materials. At the time, nobody was looking for Formosan termites or trying to quarantine anything, but they came here. But it wasn't positively identified in Louisiana until the late 1960s. So nobody even knew what to look for. They didn't know that they should be looking for this. And that really kind of gave these critters a good 20 years of uninterrupted spread within the state. So, not a really good scenario. These termites were native to Southeast China, which has a nice, warm, humid climate as well, which means that we here in New Orleans, with our nice, warm, humid climate, it was a perfect situation for these termites to become established. So we have a lovely subtropical climate here. It can be quite soupy, especially this time of year. The Formosan subterranean termite, they like to stay underground. So it's a very cryptic species. They like to stay hidden. We have wood sources everywhere in the city. So all of our historic buildings are made of wood. All of our newer construction, it's all made of wood. And even when structures are replaced, the old wood tends to get buried underground, creating a nice, wonderful buffet for termites before we build on top of it. And these termites will feed on anything containing cellulose, which I love to remind people of when they say, well, I live in a steel building, so I don't have to worry about that. And really, it's anything from the furniture to the paper backing on drywall and all that good stuff. So they really are happy where they are here. And that has allowed really the Southeast US to have a really high termite pressure. And I'm going to be talking about termite pressure today a lot. In the red here, you can see really high termite pressure. These are the nice, warm, humid, subtropical, even tropical in southern Florida, where these termites are able to become established. So here in the Southeast, that puts us at a much greater risk than, say, North Dakota for termite attack in our buildings. And the impact of termites here in the city of New Orleans is it's not just our historic structures that we're worried about, it's people's homes, and it's also our historic trees, ornamental trees, our live oaks. We have some that are hundreds of years old. They were here when the Civil War was going on, and they have become an iconic part of our landscape. Everybody, if you get a postcard from New Orleans and it has the live oaks with the Spanish moss hanging off of it, it's just iconic and it really helps make up our landscape. So we're wanting to protect these trees. There were horror stories that I heard when I first started here 20 years ago of just massive alate swarms where nighttime baseball games would have to take a break midway through the game because when the lights would come on and it would get dark, these huge, massive swarms would actually block out enough of that light. And so enough of those swarming termites were attracted to the lights to actually dim the lights a bit. So they would have to take a swarming break during a baseball game. And, it's not just that kind of nuisance impact, it's damage from weakened structures and falling trees. So we have these weakened trees and structures from termite damage, and then we have hurricanes blow through. And that really can create a very dramatic situation with falling tree branches and structural damage on people's homes. And so this level of damage, plus the cost of repairs and treatments, it really made the headlines locally and nationally. The cost estimates here on annual termite treatments and damage and repairs, that was estimated 20 years ago. So these numbers are certainly higher by now. The damage is severe. So it's a multi-billion-dollar business nationwide dealing with termites. And the impact to the French Quarter, because all of the buildings there are very historic, and some of them even historic landmarks. You can see Mr. Ed Bordas with that newspaper heading right there, that our state legislators were able to push an earmark through on other bills that led to Operation Full Stop. Operation Full Stop was a federally funded program that started in 1998 and it ran through 2012. And there were a lot of different cooperators on this project. So it certainly wasn't just us. We worked a lot with the USDA down here in New Orleans, as well as Louisiana State University Ag Center. And we worked with pest management professionals and property owners and tenants. The overall goal here was to do like a large area-wide termite control throughout the entire French Quarter. We also were doing some very fundamental research at the time to improve detection technologies for termite inspections and improving termite control while eliminating termite colonies. So there was a lot of technology transfer, talking back and forth, and a lot of education for the public and pest management professionals as well, and then working with the universities that way for that transfer of information. So Operation Full Stop, it was not just putting termite baits throughout the French Quarter. When this first started, every property owner was allowed to choose between a liquid termite treatment to protect their property from termite damage or using termite baits and putting those in the ground, okay, which would then eliminate termite colonies that would come in and hit those baits. Research conducted included monitoring all the alate swarms every spring. So from May to July, we would put these sticky cards up right below street lamps on every single street corner within the French Quarter. And those would be checked daily and counted. Okay, so we could keep tabs on what the swarms were looking like year after year. It also involved a lot of building inspections inside and out. So a lot of climbing up into attics and checking on plumbing penetrations, looking for mud tubes everywhere. So it's a lot of work. There were also trees. If you've ever been to the French Quarter, you can't see all the trees because there are some internal courtyards within these blocks of buildings. But a lot of these trees were treated with either baits or a foam injection with a liquid termiticide. Research also was conducted to delineate a lot of the termite colonies that we were seeing in the French Quarter. And this was done by both genetic analysis and using mark release recapture methods. So genetic analysis, I'm not going to go too much into that. I'm going to let Mark handle that. But in general, it's just like if somebody took my DNA and Dan Suter's DNA and analyze it, they would be able to tell that, oh, you guys are from different families. Same with termites. We can tell termite colonies apart in a very similar way. Mark release recapture methods involve collecting termites from a monitoring station somewhere in the ground, taking them back to the lab, force feeding them filter paper that has a biological stain in it, mostly either blue or red, and then taking them back to the field, putting them back in the ground right where you found them. And then a couple days later, checking neighboring monitoring stations to see how far these little blue and red termites have spread from that original station. And then you can delineate their foraging territory that way. And there are a lot of conducive conditions when you look at the French Quarter. This just shows a few of them. So we have flat roofs that hold water, creating moisture issues. There's a lot of vegetation up against the buildings and these shared walls. So shared walls can make treatment's very difficult, right? If you're doing a perimeter treatment and there are shared walls, how do you deal with that? So there were certainly certain challenges in this project just right off the bat. And this is a good aerial picture kind of showing you how green the French Quarter actually is. If you walk down the street, you see nothing but concrete streets and sidewalks. But from an aerial view, you can see how green it is inside these courtyards and how there's trees within each of these square blocks as well. So we kind of talked about the tree treatments as well. Here's another picture. Some of these are very lush, a little bit overgrown, but definitely really good harborage for some termites there. But when we're putting bait stations in the ground in an area like the French Quarter, it's solid concrete all the way from one building front across the street to the other building front. So that's all concrete. So there's not really a whole lot of soil access in the French Quarter. So a lot of drilling had to be done. So this is somebody doing core drilling. Essentially, it's drilling a 3-inch hole through concrete until you reach the soil level underneath that concrete. And throughout the French Quarter, those who had in-ground bait stations also had access to these above-ground bait stations as well. So there were plenty of properties within the French Quarter that were treated, were mud tubes and access points of where termites were actively foraging, where above-ground stations were placed directly over those termites. So the in-ground stations within the French Quarter were placed around the properties that chose to have bait stations installed. But in addition to that, there were these monitoring in-ground stations that were placed throughout the French Quarter. You can see all of the red and gray squares on this map here indicating those. So let's say you have monitoring stations around a block where there are bait stations placed in the ground. You can actually see how those termite colonies were eliminated and the activity would decline over time. And we can kind of see that in this data set here. So for the sake of time, I was not going to show you data for every single year between 1998 and 2012, but we'll just pick a couple of years here that are a few years apart. So in 2002, for example, we have this data, these colored bars that you see, that is how many months throughout the year that those monitoring stations were hit with termites. So actively foraging termites located within those monitoring stations checked on a monthly basis. Keep in mind that these were the monitoring stations, not the bait stations around people's properties. But because there's bait in the ground in the French Quarter at this time, 5 years later, we don't see as much activity. So there's still some, but we can definitely see it be reduced, and then even more so once you hit 2011. So we can see this reduction in termite stations being hit, so it reduced in termite pressure. And even from, if you graph it this way, just from 2007 to 2011, you can really kind of see that ongoing reduction in active stations in all areas of the French Quarter. However, we never really got to zero, right? We never got Formosan termites completely eradicated from the French Quarter. And there is reason for that. So one thing is there are some abandoned structures in the French Quarter where we didn't get access to do full inspections. We couldn't treat, we couldn't get in touch with the property owners. Trees in the courtyards, like I said, some people really like to have that very lush vegetation in these courtyards. And sometimes they're treated with the liquid termiticide, but really it's a pretty big conducive condition for termite attack. Buried debris, I said it before, when we do new construction here, or if a building is replaced, not all that wood gets picked up. You can find wood debris under every raised house and just know it's there. Under railroad cross ties. So creosote treated railroad cross ties. There was a huge project looking at termite activity along our riverfront railroad. And even though they're creosote treated, they still get termite attack because that creosote treatment doesn't go throughout the entire piece of wood. And that wood over time does crack. Its structure does diminish after a while, and termites can gain entry to it. So there's also hidden colonies within treated structures. So there might be aerial colonies. You can have shared walls and those kind of challenges as well. So is it possible to find every single termite colony within the French Quarter? I mean, they are cryptic. They like to stay hidden. So there are just certain challenges that come with the French Quarter. Okay, so another metric of treatment success that we used with Operation Full Stop, in addition to looking at termite activity within these monitoring stations, was using this alate surveillance data year after year. So we had these sticky cards placed on street lamps on every block in the French Quarter, swarming termites, or I should say swarming Formosan termites, are attracted to these lights at night during swarm season. And through their normal flying behavior, they get stuck to these glue cards. So these sticky cards don't have any kind of attractant or anything on them. This is just them trying to find their way to that lamppost and getting caught in the glue. And with these sticky cards being checked on a daily basis, over time, we did see a 50% reduction in the number of alates that we saw on these sticky cards. So we saw a reduction in not just the monitoring stations because there was bait put in the ground, but also there was a 50% reduction in these swarming alates. And here we can see once bait is put in the ground in certain areas. So it wasn't the entire French Quarter treated all at once, all at the same time. That's very labor intensive. So it was divided up into different areas. So here we have Area 1, which is the original 15 square blocks, and Area 2. You can see the arrows there where the bait was put in the ground for the property owners that chose to have their homes treated with bait. You can see that the reduction in surveillance starts happening soon after that. Okay, so that's for Area 1, Area 2. And we see a very similar thing for Area 3 here. So this green line here, once bait gets put in the ground, here we have Area 3. Once bait is put in the ground, and we can really see that reduction over the next couple of years. What we observed for the whole of Operation Full Stop is we saw a great reduction in termite activity in the monitoring stations that were in the ground. And we saw a reduction in the number of alates that were captured every year for our surveillance. But really, overall termite pressure within the French Quarter was greatly reduced. But then the, great things, it's not going to last forever, right? So in 2012, they ended up pulling the funding as it was an earmark, and they had slashed all earmarks out of the federal budget. It ended up being that all property owners in the French Quarter were notified, like, hey, we're not able to do this for free anymore on the federal government's dime. So please consider a private pest control company and having your property under contract. This was the decision, and the earmark causes some of these major cuts. So in 2012, that was the end of this era. And of course, from our perspective in the pest control industry, we're worried, right? You're giving something at no cost to a property owner for so long and then saying like, well, now you have to pay for it. We were not sure how many property owners were actually going to do that. How many would actually start paying for this service with the private pest control company? How many people would get termite contracts on their properties? And then we kind of wondered, well, what could we still do as a city agency? Because we don't want to drop everything completely, but we realized that we could still monitor alates year after year without this huge cost of labor or equipment or anything like that. So we've still been doing alate surveillance year after year, just not at the same capacity that it was during Operation Full Stop. We started back up in 2015 to present. It's not really labor intensive. We're not going out every day like they were during Operation Full Stop, but we'll do it. We'll go out twice a week to get our counts and replace sticky cards. We do that from April to July. And we're still attaching the same kind of glue boards to clipboards, but we are incorporating wire mesh around those glue boards. And that's just to help protect some of the non-target organisms that are coming in hoping to feed on termites. Like we don't want birds stuck on these glue boards or lizards or anything like that. Now, we are kind of doing this at a reduced capacity. So instead of hitting streetlights on every corner within the French Quarter, we kind of limited it to 35 traps. We tried to spread them out. We actually picked these locations. We would go out at night and find street lamps that were, well, A, working properly, and B, weren't so overshadowed by other light sources from big neon signs or, the clubs on Bourbon Street or anything like that. So we wanted to make sure that there wasn't too much light competition and the street lights were working. And what we expected, I, for one, was in this boat. I really thought nobody's going to want to pay for this. Nobody's going to want to pay for the upkeep or the termite contract. They've been getting this for free for so long. And if they don't, we're really going to see these numbers just skyrocket. And we're going to be able to say, hey, we still need money for this because look at what's happening now that the funding was pulled, really using the surveillance as a measure of that big spike in termite activity. However, we saw the complete opposite of what I had expected. Now, granted, this is really good news, right, for property owners. We still see this trend in reduced alate numbers over time. And you can even see here, total alates used to be upwards of thousands and thousands, whereas just last year in 2024, maybe we broke 1,000 total. So it's a really good trend to see. Now, if we look at all of our sticky traps in the French Quarter, I thought, let's try to see where these are. Are they localized somewhere? Maybe they're coming in from neighboring areas. Who knows? So I looked at the data, and in 2022, it's just really kind of all over the place. I mean, there's plenty along the riverfront, but I mean, there's some of these larger circles in the center of the French Quarter as well. Now, however, a large circle, this looks much more dramatic than it is because we're talking like 300 termites for that trap instead of 3,000. So it's still a really good trend to see. But what would continue to this continued alate pressure? Well, at this time, we didn't really know how many buildings are still treated with bait that can wipe some of these colonies out. Also, the French Quarter was involved in Operation Full Stop, but not the neighboring areas. So you have all of these surrounding neighborhoods that can have termites in them, and alates can fly a pretty long distance. So around a full kilometer. And, it's been published where using fluorescent powder they were able to track termites from across the river. And if the wind is just right and the wind direction is just right, they can be swept across the river into the French Quarter. So that was done with flying out of an infested tree here while they're flying, being dusted with a fluorescent dye, being picked up on sticky traps across the river. So that's how that was done. So they can fly a pretty good distance. Formosan termites don't necessarily need contact with soil to survive. So they can have aerial colonies, they can stay hidden within trees, all kinds of stuff. So if we're looking at just the alate data, can we say that monitoring alates is still a good metric for success of area-wide treatment? And the best I can do, unfortunately, is a good hard maybe. So it really kind of depends on the size of the area and what's going on in the neighboring areas. Also, it doesn't take into real consideration aerial colonies that are not in contact with soil that won't be hitting those bait stations unless you're able to go in with an above ground bait. But we still see this decreasing alate pressure. We are also trapping them at Jackson Barracks, but Mark's going to talk more about that. But in the French Quarter, we're still seeing this reduction in alate pressure. And at this point, with this reduction in the area instead of an increase that we had expected, it really does kind of beg the question, well, what's the current status of bait stations in the ground in the French Quarter? So this was back in 2022, 23, where our crews went out. It was the middle of July. It was hot as heck, but we went block by block. And within each property, in front of each property, there were these port covers that you could see in the sidewalk. And we would start popping those open and looking in there to see if we could see termite bait, or was there nothing there. So if it contained bait, it would be considered that, okay, well, that property picked up a termite contract. But if there was nothing in those bait stations, we considered it not baited. Some of them even had the really old Centricon ESPs, like just the wood monitoring stations in them. So we did not count that as recent termite baiting system. But if it was something like that, we assumed that the property was not treated with bait. However, this does not go into the deep dive of, okay, were any of them treated with a liquid termiticide? That information we did not collect for this particular part of the study. But we did do this block by block throughout the entire French Quarter, just popping open core caps and seeing what was inside. So here we have a building footprint of all the buildings within the French Quarter. And what we found was that it is about half and half baits and no baits. So the yellow boxes here are all the buildings where we found bait products and under the core caps surrounding that building. Sometimes it was the compressed Trelona for the advanced stations, and then sometimes it was the Centricon HD. Those were the two bait products that we would find in the ground here. And then for those where we didn't see recent bait products in the ground, we would consider those not baited. So it's about half and half. So what does this mean for pest control? Station placement is important, especially if you're doing area-wide treatment. So let's say you have this hypothetical neighborhood and there's really high termite pressure. So every different colored blob on this screen is a different termite colony. And then some of these property owners are going to put bait stations around their houses. Okay. So that's going to wipe out the colonies that were feeding on those bait stations. So now you have this area clear of those termite colonies, but this creates a void, and nature doesn't like voids. So what's going to happen then is certain smaller colonies that were not detected before are going to start expanding their foraging territory and spreading out. And then other colonies are going to be expanding their foraging territories as well, like this orange one and this yellow one here. So really, this elimination of large mature colonies allows for the establishment of small, newer colonies. There's more available resources. They can spread out a little bit. They will reuse the same tunneling system underground. That just means the ideal bait spacing might be different, right, after area-wide control tactics. So would this be more effective if all the buildings had bait stations around them? Absolutely. But we are still seeing that reduction in termite numbers in the French Quarter. So just about half of the properties in the French Quarter are still using baits to help control termites. We're still seeing this drop in alate numbers year after year. And it's really important that property owners consider the use of baits because smaller colonies will increase their foraging territories and start to spread out where these larger mature colonies once occupied. And it's really interesting how that data was also collected because I want to go over real quick what was happening next door to the French Quarter during this time. So Operation Full Stop was in full swing in the French Quarter here. That's that giant blue rectangle on the screen. And in red is Louis Armstrong Park. A lot of green space, a large area, a history of high termite activity within the park. And it's not just Formosan termites in this park, but it's also our native reticulate termites. Okay, so it's right next door to the French Quarter. This was really Dr. Nanyasu's personal private termite playground for several years, from 98 to 2014. So for 16 years, there was enough research going on in this park to handle 2 graduate student degrees and many, many publications. And if you don't want to go through and read all of those publications, probably 20 plus publications, there is a really nice synopsis of this entire project in the annual review of entomology. It really kind of breaks it up into 5 different phases of the research that was done in this park. So starting out, they went into the park and putting down monitoring stakes and monitoring stations, collecting samples and using genetic analysis and mark release recapture methods, determining how many colonies are in that park and what do the foraging territories look like. What they found was that there were 13 individual Formosan subterranean termite colonies. Again, this was done using genotyping methods, so DNA analysis and dyeing termites and following them to other monitoring stations to see where those foraging territories are. They could also determine how many breeding pairs were in each colony, so you can have multiple kings and queens. And genetic analysis will show whether there's a single king and queen at the head of that colony, or if it's an extended family colony that has multiple kings and queens. Okay, so all that information can be determined. So we have 13 colonies in the park starting out. Okay, and then let's find out what happens to some of these colonies when one of the colonies is baited and that void is created. So that's where that research comes in. So here we have 13 colonies. At the time, it was Recruit 2 was being used in Centricon. So it was that far back. 3 colonies were selected to be eliminated using bait with hexafluoron. And what they found was that, okay, so they picked these 3 colonies, so number 2, 3, and 9, put bait in the ground, termites would hit it, feed on it, and become eliminated. And they found that new colonies started replacing where those previous colonies were, and then others would extend their foraging territories as well. And so this is the island in Armstrong Park. Let me go back one slide. So this area right here is what I'm going to be looking at, where one of these colonies was eliminated. So we have 3 Formosan colonies, 1 Reticulitermes colony. We are going to wipe out this yellow colony right here. So we put bait in the ground, let them feed on it. They're going to become eliminated. But as they're dying out, look at what's happening with this red colony up here. It is gradually expanding its foraging territory. It is taking over that area, using the same underground tunnels as the previous colony was using, and it has just exploded and has been able to spread out. So this is what we mean by high termite pressure. You can have several different colonies in a relatively small space, and if you wipe a few of them out, you're still going to have other colonies ready to fill that void where those previous colonies were. So phase 3 of the Armstrong Park project had the goal of wiping out every detectable colony within the entire park. So if a termite colony hit a monitoring station, there would be bait put in. This started out using still Recruit 2 with hexafluoron, but then Recruit 3 came on the market with novafluoron, and then that was used as well. So within the park, every little green dot on this map represents an in-ground station. Okay, so there are over 800 in-ground stations installed. Bait was used to target all of the detectable colonies. So if a station got hit with termites, that monitor would be switched out for bait with hexafluoron or novafluoron. This is how those 13 colonies were eliminated. And it was considered eliminated if we didn't see any new termite activity for 2 months. Now, all these stations were being checked monthly at this time. So these 13 colonies were completely wiped out. Once it was eliminated, then those baits would be replaced with the old wooden monitoring devices, the old ESP Centricon stations. So now we have a park with no detectable termites in it. A dream come true, right? But then what? The next phase of this project is, okay, we have a fully empty park. It's a big, big void. Nature hates a void. So how are termites going to reinfest this park? So checking stations on a monthly basis again, we are looking at nuptial pairs being located in these monitoring stations. And all that means is that as they're flying around, pairing up and coming to the ground, they're making their way into these monitoring stations as a king and queen ready to start a new colony. Okay, within this giant void of a park. There were also actively foraging termites being found in some of these monitoring stations as well. And all of these reinvading colonies were delineated, and we could tell them apart using the same DNA analysis and marker release recapture methods. Okay, so we have our 13 original eliminated colonies here on the left. Here in the middle where these stars are, you can see, oh, these cute little Formosan nuptial pairs are starting to form. They're ready to start laying eggs and having babies and creating a new colony, right? But it wasn't just the Formosan termites. It was also the Reticula germes. Here you can see this red star up here. So we're dealing with 2 different species in this park still. And then we also have these reinvading colonies. So these are the foraging termites that are being observed within these monitoring stations. So you have some popping up on the outskirts of the park around the perimeter. Okay, well, that's not a huge shock because the neighboring areas aren't necessarily treated with bait either. And as we know, if they want to spread out their foraging territory to fill a void, they'll do that. However, if you look at the middle of the park, where did these guys come from? Because they haven't had enough time to have a brand new mating pair start a new colony that can have foraging termites in these monitors. And interestingly enough, there is this overlap of foraging territories. So this is another situation of these previously undetected colonies finally having a way to spread out their foraging territory and actually use some of the resources that colonies there before them were using before they were baited. So you have here, so you have nuptial pairs, you have established colonies, we like to call them concealed colonies, expanding their foraging territories that we just didn't know were there before. Okay, you can have colonies from outside the park, expanding their foraging territories and kind of coming in along the borders of that park. Within 53 months, if you have all the termite colonies that you can find baited within this park, within 5 years, it came back full force with these delineated colonies that you see on this map here. So again, all the colonies wiped out within the park, replaced all the baits with wood. Within 5 years, you have the same level of termite pressure as you had when this project first started. So that's what we're talking about with termite pressure here in the South. Now, the last portion of this project had to do with sustainable management. That's what this HD bait coming out, and my gosh, what a game changer that has been. So termite bait that only has to be checked once a year has been a game changer for the industry. And there's other products on the market too. So there's the Trelona with the compressed tablets as well that only had to be checked once a year once they're on the ground. So really a game changer, a lot less labor intensive. But anyway, these stations were placed in the ground as they became available. So when this was going on, this is 2010, this was brand new on the market. We didn't have 800 HD baits to put in the ground. So as they became available, we would bait colony by colony. So this started in September of 2010. So baits were placed in 13 stations. By 2011, baits were placed in 6 more stations. 2012, more bait in 16 more stations. July 2012, okay, 3 more stations. And 2013, baits were placed in 4 stations. And this is where it gets interesting, is 2014, where baits were placed in 2 additional stations. But we began to notice these interception events where you have the bait in the ground and it eliminates the colony that's existing there. And another colony has moved into that foraging territory, fed on the same bait, and it's really killing 2 birds with 1 stone, right? So the same bait station has eliminated more than 1 colony. And from that time, as you can see here, all the orange stars here are where Recruit HD was put in the ground, and those pink circles were those original eliminated colonies. And during this time, no new activity was observed. But this project that has lasted 16 years has given us some really big take-home lessons here that we also see during the Operation Full Stop era. Okay, first, if baits are removed from an area of high termite pressure, it can become repopulated to that same level of termite pressure within 5 years. So essentially, once baits go in the ground, you really do want to leave them there forever and keep up on those termite contracts. If you eliminate colonies, those foraging territories will become reoccupied by neighboring colonies that were undetectable before, or brand new incipient colonies. And sustainable management, such as these baits that can go in the ground and be checked once a year, it's compressed cellulose, it's high density, it's highly durable. They do make these allowances for these interception events to happen, right? So you wipe out 1 colony, and if a neighboring colony moves into those foraging territories, they can also feed on that bait and become eliminated as well. And between Operation Full Stop and Armstrong Park, a lot of hands were in on this. So there were a lot of collaborators who participated in Operation Full Stop. You can see those up here. A lot of our staff, University of Florida. A couple things here before I'm going to turn it over. You'll notice that I put my contact information in the top right here. Feel free to either take this down, snap a picture of it. We love to nerd out about termites. So if anybody has questions about Formosan subterranean termites, or you want more information on baiting strategies or treatment strategies or doing an inspection, please just let us know. We are a really good resource to have. We're civil servants. This is what we do. And please follow us on Twitter, which is now X, and Instagram and Facebook at NOLA Mosquito. Lots of good information coming out on those platforms as well. And with that, I will stop sharing my screen.
Good stuff, Carrie. So I'll save them till the very end. But for the audience here, she just summarized a 15-year project or more than that, right? So your 25-year project on from the start of Full Stop until current day. So quite a large project. And it's important to note, I think you talked about this in the beginning, but the breadth of your unit, and maybe you or Claudia can talk about this a little bit later, or Mark can comment on it. You have 30 or 40 people in the unit out there. It's a huge group out there, and it's a very unique, what you do is so unique. There's not another group like you guys in the country. And you're going to hear from this group later on this year talking about rodents and mosquitoes. This group does
No.
ants and rodents and diseases and mosquitoes
We
and
do it all. And I know Claudia's on this call, so I want to make sure I'm saying the right things, right? But we do it all. We do termite work for city properties. We do general pest control for our city buildings, rodent control and mosquito abatement for all of Orleans Parish. We do outreach events. We're having Bug Fest coming up this year. We do symposiums. We are a very, very busy group, but we love what we do and we have a passion for what we do. We have a very dedicated staff. I think we are floating around 50 right now. It's not all just one organism that we're focused on. So we're cross-trained. And so we have termite folks that can do mosquito work. We have mosquito folks that can do rodent work. We have rodent folks that can do termite work. So it's really and it's all based on IPM practices.
I know this, when I visited you guys several times, it's infectious. The excitement that people have in your unit, it's infectious. It's kind of an attaboy there for the interest in science and the inroads that you're making there. But I think we'll go ahead and I'm going to save some questions. I hope everybody else has some questions for Dr. Cottone in a little bit, but we'll take about a 10-minute break. Is that okay, Richie? And we'll start back. Let's make it 9 minutes, and we'll start back with Mark right at 4:00. Thanks, Carrie.
Sounds perfect, Dan. We'll see
All right.
everybody back.
My pleasure. Thank you.
See everybody at 4.
All right. Well, welcome back, everybody. And I hope you had a good break. I'm going to switch gears a little bit and have our next speaker is Dr. Mark Janowiecki. Mark is a research entomologist with the city. It's called the City of New Orleans Mosquito, Termite, and Rodent Control Board. He's been with them since 2020. And in my previous discussion with Dr. Cottone, if you're hearing this and you ever go out to New Orleans for vacation, I'd encourage you to see if you might be able to visit that group. They do a lot of tours out there, and you would be very impressed with the facilities and the group that they have out there. So Mark has always been interested in insects, and he studied throughout his graduate degrees, and he's been applying molecular tools to understand their biology. He leads the termite division for the city, which protects city facilities and the incredibly historic buildings there in New Orleans. And he also manages the molecular laboratory, the molecular biology lab, which conducts pathogen surveillance in mosquitoes, rodents, and rodent ectoparasites. So Mark, I'll go ahead and turn the floor over to you.
Okay, thank you. Let me share my screen here.
All right.
Looks
Okay.
good.
Does that look okay?
Yeah,
looks
looking
great.
good.
Awesome, thanks. So yeah, I'm going to follow up on what Carrie went over and kind of talk about another area-wide control project that we did here, kind of comparing to what she presented in the French Quarter, looking at the Jackson Barracks. I have kind of a few little research big net talks that we'll go through for the next hour here. Okay, so area-wide control, as Carrie already presented, but I just want to kind of help solidify here. Area-wide control is using this pest control collectively rather than at an individual property. So rather than each of these houses conducting their own pest control, you could work to exclude something like termites or the population of termites in this whole area. So rather than just building that little wall of chemical around a single structure here, you could make this whole area devoid. And I think Carrie showed some great examples in the French Quarter and in Armstrong Park, where we were able to reduce those pest populations. But looking at that, there's a couple important characteristics of pests and why, we're doing this on termites, but we're not doing this on filth flies or cockroaches or something else. And it's a couple of these characteristics. The pest has to have low mobility, so they can't be moving quickly and very far, just dispersing or all around the area and kind of reestablishing. And they need to have a slow generation time. So it needs to not be a pest that can, like flies or mosquitoes, that can reproduce and have multiple generations in a really short period. And so that's really good for termites. And it worked really well here, where pest control is difficult in these French Quarter buildings that don't have distinct buildings and areas that are able to be worked on an individual basis. So Carrie presented the work in the French Quarter there on the left, and in Armstrong Park. I'm going to go a little bit further down the Mississippi River here to the Jackson Barracks and talk about some of the work we did there. The Jackson Barracks is the headquarters for the Louisiana National Guard. It's located in the 9th Ward, which you've probably remember from news of Hurricane Katrina, was very severely flooded, had extensive flood damage. This whole headquarters for the National Guard had to be reconstructed from scratch, or in some cases renovated, but it was a $35 million project after Katrina. This was all rebuilt, and all of these buildings were put in after a few years. They reached out to us here in the city and said, we have extensive termite problems everywhere. Can you help us with this? And, initially they wanted to help with some of the bid specs. And we kind of went from, we can help you with the specs, turned into an intergovernmental agreement where we were able to do the control there and set them up in this area-wide control program, really taking care of this whole area. We installed the baits around all of these buildings. So installed bait stations around 170 buildings and 10 trees between 2014 and 2018. This is almost 8,000 linear feet and over 2,300 stations. So there's a very, very large amount of bait that went into the ground there. And this is protecting that entire area. So by putting the bait around all these buildings, we're helping to protect, the adjacent buildings. The stations were checked annually. Samples were collected for genetic analysis. And similar to how Carrie showed in Armstrong Park, we were able to characterize the colonies with this microsatellite DNA markers. So this is a map of the Jackson Barracks, chunked into two pieces to show these two parts that are really this long sliver with a small section in between with fewer buildings. But across this area, we had 10 treated trees, as you see there. We mapped out our termite colonies. So again, it was a majority of these were Formosan subterranean termites. The Formosan subterranean termites really taken over in this area and has displaced our native species. But we did have 4 colonies of our native reticulotermes. When we came in and added the baits, we had a large number of hits. So in this first year, all of these red stars, 52 red stars were our hit baits. So we had 52 stations bait hit. Almost 10 full tubes were consumed. Each tube is enough to kill at least multiple colonies. All of these 18 colonies that we characterized were eliminated by these baits. We still wanted to follow up, and similar to how Carrie showed the different ways of seeing, is our area-wide control successful in reducing the termite pressure? So we conducted the same sort of alate trapping that Carrie outlined in this area. We had already been continuing our surveillance in the French Quarter. So we wanted to compare to the French Quarter, how many sticky traps or how many termites are on these sticky traps that we put out at night as we collect these swarming termites. And these swarming termites, the Formosan, are great for this sort of surveillance because they're those nighttime flyers, as you see in the video there, where they're coming out at night rather than our native reticulotermes species that are day flyers and wouldn't be nearly as easy to sample in this way. We compared our swarming activity starting in 2015 after this project was initiated, and generally we saw less activity in the French Quarter than in the Jackson Barracks. Sorry for the typo on the slide there. Generally, the dashed line of the French Quarter, although it kind of hits up here a little bit higher, it's generally lower than these. And as the years go on, you can really see this pattern where the dashed line of the French Quarter is lower than that of the Jackson Barracks as we go on. So it's 2018, 2019, we lost some data due to a city cyber attack, but 2020, we continue, we see the dashed line is lower. 21, 22, 23, 24, and then this year in 2025, we had this major spike here in the Jackson Barracks, but very little numbers, French Quarter alates. Throwing all these graphs that I just cycled through together on top of each other, it's kind of a mess of lines here, but it really shows our swarm season as a whole here in New Orleans, where we start up in early May, sometimes end of April, go through about mid-June, but are really highlighting around that middle of May, where we have the most swarms. This is showing similar data. Carrie showed the results already for the French Quarter, kind of that dashed line on the bottom. But you can see the downward trend does occur as well in the Jackson Barracks, but these are consistently higher. We have consistently more alates. And if you look statistically, we had more termites per trap in the Jackson Barracks than in the French Quarter. So even though these are both under area-wide control, there's still many more alates in the Jackson Barracks site. We want to know, why are there so many alates? What's going on here? Despite having successful control, we're not having buildings falling down anymore. We're not having tons of termite damage found and active termites found. We still have all of these swarming. Kind of going back to Carrie's question, is this a good metric or not? Maybe. Is this working or not? We wanted to see, we had effective control of the termites, but we didn't have that major decline. We had kind of a general decline going on, but we saw that same thing in the French Quarter, so we're not convinced that's from our intervention. In 2021, we collected the termites off those sticky cards. So we found that we could pick them off with a little toothpick sort of thing, throw them in an individual vial and run them for colony identification, just like we were doing for samples to get those colonies in the different areas. And from that, we were able to look at an individual sticky card on an individual night and see how many termite colonies contributed to the alates that we found on there. So if we found a sticky card covered in termites, how many colonies flew? Was it, a combination of 10 or 15, or was it just a single colony that's still there, to kind of get an idea of not just how many alates are out, but how many colonies are still in the area. And then I'll show these results in this way. So across the top are the parental kind of parents, the parental genotypes, and then across the bottom are individual alates pulled off the board. And then this blue line connects to the king, or the male line, and the pink line connects to the queen. As we add more individuals here, you can see there's about 30 individuals across the bottom. This first whole cluster here all go to this colony 1, the single colony, king 1 and queen 1. We had a single individual from a second colony, 4 individuals from a third colony, and then a single individual from a fourth colony. So this sticky card results for this one would be a number of colonies contributing of 4 colonies. When we looked at some of the sticky cards from the Jackson Barracks, we had a lot more numbers across the top. You can see there's some of them kind of clustered together where there might be these 4 or so are in one cluster, but many of them are individual colonies. So we had about 15 colonies contributing to this one. When we did more of these, this is a sampling of some of our data here, you can see the French Quarter have these big clusters, like the example I showed here on the right, whereas the Jackson Barracks, there's a lot less clustering, there's a lot more colonies contributing. So in fact, we had a higher number of colonies contributing to the sticky cards in the Jackson Barracks compared to that in the French Quarter, with an average of 5 or 6, whereas there was more like 13, 14, 15 in the Jackson Barracks. So this is showing that there's a wide variety of colonies that are flying and contributing to these sticky cards. What we found is overall, we do have successful area-wide control of our Formosan termites in the barracks, as shown by, we're not having issues in the houses, we're not having the houses falling down and all of these sorts of things, but we still have this strong alate pressure. And so the strong alate pressure, Carrie went over this, but just to summarize again, this is the surrounding colonies. So Jackson Barracks is this long, skinny section. There's a lot more surrounding areas where these termites are flying in, and alates can fly a long distance, so they were coming in from a long ways away. We also have the potential that some of these colonies are not in contact with the soil, leading them, not sending them into our bait stations if they're in trees or in aerial colonies. Okay, so that's the first story I wanted to tell. The next is a longer story of what we've done here over time. Although we're stationed in the city of New Orleans, we've really worked to look into trapping and trying to figure out how is the Formosan spreading throughout Louisiana. So there's been a long history here of trying to really map out the distribution here in the state. And so for our searching, we have a few different detection methods. So obviously we go out and deliberately search where we're turning over logs, doing those sorts of things. We also do a lot of light trapping. This is the swarm, I think about 1.5 years ago now, but this is my backyard on one of those good nights. So we had the lights on and you can see all coming out. So again, just to reiterate, the termite does fly at night and is attracted to lights, which makes it much easier to survey in this way. So light trapping is very viable for a Formosan termite, whereas our native termites are less attracted to lights and are flying during the daytime. We've also looked into help from pest control professionals, so sending in samples, sending in kits, different ways of contributing these samples. For our deliberate searching, we've taken these trips where we go into parks, different areas of the state where we haven't found them yet. We're looking at fallen logs, wood landscaping, really any cellulose material. We've even found them before in people's mailboxes, so we're looking all over the place. Generally, we focus, take out the map and look for public land in urban areas. So we're looking in cemeteries, parks, golf courses, churches, anywhere they'll let us in to kind of poke around and see if we can find termites in an area. With our deliberate searching, the Formosan subterranean termite is different than our native species in that they attack trees. So this leads tree inspections to be a very viable way of finding these termites. The swarm season is in the spring, as I showed. And so when they're ready to swarm, they need to build these swarm castles or structures on the tree that allow them to send out all of these alates from the tree. These mud tubes are really going to be more abundant on the outside of trees right before they're ready to swarm. So in that swarm season, we really try to focus this searching in more of April and May to find them easily in that way. We can find the swarm castles, we can find mud tubes going up the bark. So if you locate mud trails on the bark and scrape them open, then we'll see these Formosan soldiers responding, coming out with this very soldier abundant species coming out and finding them there. We also look all over the tree, so their alate dispersal structures can be in scars from cut limbs. As you see all the mud caked in the area here, the termites are ready to fly at the base of the tree, in the nooks and crannies. At times, extreme measures are sometimes required. Climbing up the tree, you might not see any indication on the ground, but when you look up high in the tree, you might see a little bit of mud in one of the scars or where the limbs were. And that might be the only place you can easily find them on the tree. So sometimes you have to climb the tree or get ladders or really kind of work a little harder to find these termites. At times when we're inspecting trees, if the termites still can't be detected on the outside, they still may be infested on the inside. So when we're searching for termites, we'll also drill into a tree. So you can take a gas-powered auger and drill into the tree, and then insert a borescope or a flexible video scope to see inside the void. If you're drilling inside the tree, you can feel when it goes from drilling through the wood to drilling into a void, as it really kind of gets a lot easier to drill and see if there's termites inside of there. Then we use the borescope to look inside of this void, which could just be a rotten center of the tree, or it could be a termite carton nest. So we send this borescope in to see. So we have a video here from Ed Freitag. Ed Freitag's been with the city of New Orleans for quite a long time. He's now retired, but we're lucky enough to keep him around at least part-time to help us with these inspections and a lot of his photography skills. You might know Ed from his work with NPMA's Tiny Termite House. He did a lot of the photography and work as they infested this miniature model of a home with thousands of Formosan termites and showed the progression of the house falling down. But he provided this video here. So this is going inside of a tree. It's a really neat video showing that video probe going inside and finding the termites in. So kind of like a B-rated horror movie. Here is getting inside of there. You can see lots of termites inside the tunnel. We see lots of soldiers. So this is obviously Formosan termites there. As we get further and further, obviously this is a very infested spot in the tree. Once we get to the middle, you'll start to see some of that carton nest. So we've really hit the center of this colony, and they're inside of this tree. But this tree might have shown no signs on the outside. So without drilling into the tree and finding this central void where you have to drill until you really find a soft spot there, then you can send this video probe in and inspect for the termites there. But it's really important to look at trees in general when doing work at a house. It's important not just to think about that house that you might be treating, but go out in the yard and see if the tree, if you're in Formosan area of the country, see if this tree is infested, because that might be where the actual colony is that's attacking the house. And until you really deal with that tree and those termites, you might be kind of missing it there. As we look for termites, we also use light trapping. So as I mentioned, they're attracted to lights. So we put these light traps out. Sometimes we'll put these light traps with their mesh covering, as Carrie described, out in different parts of the state. They can be either, serviced by a person there, or sometimes we would even leave them out for the season. But oftentimes they require replacing a couple times a week. I'm going to come back at the end of the talk and introduce the North American Termite Survey, which I think Santos might be on the call here. I saw on the participant list. But this is a great effort that if you want to participate in this light trapping, they'll set you up with all the supplies and really get this going. I have a slide coming up for that. We also, in our searching, Timothy, who will be talking later this year more about rodents, knows a whole lot about termites and has done a lot of this search throughout the state. His favorite spot to try to find alates is at gas station lights. So these gas stations sometimes can be the only light out in the middle of nowhere. And outside these gas stations are inevitably lots of spiders that have monopolized on all these critters that are flying into the lights. Well, if these termites fly, they might fly and land in these spider webs and leave behind sometimes even just the wings. So he likes to go around and in these areas of the state where we're still trying to find termites, look and see if we can find termite wings or termite alates that might have flown in the last few days, landed in these cobwebs around the gas station. And some of our parish records have come from termites like this. And then finally, pest control sample submission. So we're always happy to get samples sent in. Here at the city of New Orleans, we regularly identify samples from pest control and our citizens. But we've gone through and had different kits at different times where we can send out kits of alcohol. If you collect termites and you want to send them in, you can send them in an alcohol vial or freeze them until you send them. But it's useful to be able to identify what these species might be if you're finding something weird. At the city of New Orleans, we also have a way you can submit pictures online. So you can submit pictures through our website. I have the link down there at the bottom where you can look for online identification, where you put in your name and submit the pictures, or you can send the specimens into our building and we'll identify them. So as we talk about the Formosan subterranean termite, I want to zoom out just a little bit here and talk about its invasion history. Carrie talked about this, but when I was at Texas A&M, I did my PhD with Dr. Ed Bargo. One of my lab mates, Alex Blumenfeld, looked at a very large data set for genetic analysis of comparing our termites found in mainland China, Hawaii, and then across the United States to try to track its invasion history. And he found a really neat story here where he found there were multiple introductions into the United States. So you can see kind of the purple and the green. There were multiple introductions, the purple coming from this new population that occurred in Hawaii. There are multiple introductions from mainland China into Hawaii in probably the 1880s. That's what the analysis showed. And this then caused a bridgehead where there was a bridgehead in Hawaii that was then introduced into Louisiana or Texas. The bridgehead effect is borrowed from military terminology, but just is a case where an invasive species is introduced from an invasive population rather than from its native population. There was also an introduction from mainland China into more like Florida. So Hawaii introduced into Louisiana, Texas, probably in all of these ports coming back from World War II. But there was a second introduction into Florida. So this allowed a lot of genetic diversity to be introduced in the United States and has allowed this to get past that genetic bottlenecking, where we think of if we only bring over a single termite colony over from where it's from to where it's introduced, maybe that one colony is not good at dealing with a certain fungus that it's exposed to here and it'll die out. But with this kind of increased genetic variation and kind of posed for invasion, this has really gotten a good foothold and is abundant throughout the Southeast US. In Louisiana specifically, it was initially discovered, as Carrie mentioned, in 1966. So it was identified in 1966, thought to have come over after World War II. So that was given almost 20 years or more of time to spread and get a foothold before we even knew it was there. So for 20 years, people just didn't realize that their termites were now different and allowed it to get that stronghold. Immediately after it was found and identified, LDAF, our Louisiana Department of Ag and Forestry, quarantined it in 1967. It was initially found in two of our big major port cities, New Orleans and Lake Charles. New Orleans being on the Mississippi River and Lake Charles on the Calcasieu River. Both of these handled lots of military cargo, and both were the only deep draft ports in Louisiana. So this makes total sense why these were the first two spots that they were found. And just as a disclaimer, as we keep going, in Louisiana, we have parishes instead of counties. It's the same thing, just a different name. So we'll talk about parishes here as we go through the spread. Throughout time, it was spread by lumber and infested utility poles. So you can see it spread to a couple of parishes nearby Orleans in the eastern part of the state. King and Spink characterized some of the foraging galleries. This is kind of a teaser for the final section in my talk, the third section that I'll have coming up, where we try to look at how these termites are foraging, kind of talking about some of our current research and where we're going. But they were along the Calcasieu River in Lake Charles, and they were able to dig out and excavate all of the tunnels and really understand where they were foraging, because it was a nice sandy riverbank, so they were much easier to excavate the area. In 1987, they were discovering a 30-year-old problem at that point. They'd been here for quite some time. The Formosan termite was considered to be established, and it's now occurring in the most highly populated parishes. So Baton Rouge is our number one most populated parish. The greater New Orleans area has our second, third, and fourth most populated parish. Lafayette is our fifth most, and Lake Charles our seventh most. So this is following people. People are really spreading this, and it's really obvious as you can see it jump from urban center to urban center. In the early 2000s, members of our group here, led by Matt Messenger, were trying to look at a statewide survey. So they had many pest control companies sending in samples, city and state agencies searching, as well as our group searching. And this took place from January 1999 to August 2002. They had 812 samples and discovered it in 13 new parishes. These 812 samples were all termite species. So they said, send me any termite, we'll look at that, not just Formosan. So that's why there's so many samples there. So they still found it occurs in these highly populated parishes, the greater Baton Rouge area, the greater New Orleans parishes, Lafayette, and Lake Charles, but adding in this kind of northern spot up here in Monroe, jumping into northern Louisiana. So this reiterates, people move termites. So the termites do fly and will disperse in that way. But as Carrie mentioned, they're not the best flyers. And if the wind's right, they might make it a kilometer. So every generation of termites, which is every time a single king and queen that start a colony are mature enough to send out alates after 4 or 5 years, they're going to move a kilometer. So if they're moving a kilometer every 5 years, there's no way they're going to make it this far across the state. So people are moving these termites. There was a second round of this kind of statewide survey. 3 parishes were confirmed after reports from pest control professionals and residents. There were sticky cards trapped nearby and collections from logs and wood debris. And 2 parishes were discovered from deliberate searching, but we're kind of filling in this map as we go. And then in subsequent years, 2006, our 7, 8, and 9, there were 6, 4, and 4 parishes for a total of 14 more parishes. So now we've kind of rounded out this whole southern part of the state with the addition of that one parish up north, which is the Monroe, an urban center. We employed a variety of light traps, sticky traps, and some bucket traps there. After this, in subsequent years, 2013, we had active collecting trips. We collected lots of bugs and lots of critters. Same in 2017, 2023, we sent out some traps as well and did an active collecting trip. In 2016, there was a news article confirming that they found Formosan termites up in Bossier in northwest Louisiana. So now we've really hit the urban centers, as a lot of the other parts in northern Louisiana are more rural and not as well populated. These are the urban centers as well as the southern part of the state. So overall, these termites are widespread across the state. They're spread through infested materials. This could be railroad ties. We found entire colonies contained in things like boats on trailers. So if you pick up this boat and move it across the state, now you've moved a whole termite colony. And they follow our human population centers. So these termites are really hitching a ride with humans. We've also started with our alate monitoring. We started a swarmometer at our building. So if you follow us on social media, as Carrie mentioned, at NOLA Mosquito on any of these 3 platforms, we started in 2022, put our light trap in the garage and checked it each weekday for a daily post. So we have our different characters here. Carrie helped me put together these different names, whether it's just a few termites steadily climbing, spiking, or a termite date night, where all these termites are out trying to find a future king and queen to start a nest with. And at different times, we've had a decent reach. We've almost 1,600 people on X, or over 230 people on Instagram. So this is just not a predictive measure, but a way of saying what we've seen in the past. We kind of can summarize it here. So in 2023, similar to the data I showed earlier in the French Quarter and Jackson Barracks, we had several big swarms. So we had 3 nights that were big swarms, over 30 individuals, and the activities there in late April to the end of May. We've even had attention from our local news. We had a newscaster come and want to cover our swarmometer. So we welcomed him into our building, showed him some of our termites and how it works, and kicked off swarm season on the news as well. So I mentioned there's the North American Termite Survey. The goals are to collate and document locations with the Formosan subterranean termite, trapping on that marginal record for marginal area for new records, as well as creating really good training material and training webinars that are posted on the website. If you scan the QR code, you can sign up to get more information and some exciting results already from the first year of trapping in 2025. There were 7 new counties or parishes, and there were many successful trainings. I think we kicked off a really good training early this year in January. This is led by Dr. Santos Portugal at Mississippi State, Dr. Janowiecki Sharma at Florida A&M, and Dr. Ashbrook at Louisiana State. If you want more information, scan the QR code here or reach out to me or to any of these people, and we can get you in contact. This can be used for really good training opportunities, but also if you're in an area that might have Formosan subterranean termites, we can send traps to help you document the spread as it moves into that area. Okay, and then the final section of my talk that I want to cover, this is some of kind of our new research and where we're kind of going with a lot of our research now, is really trying to look at termite foraging. And so we want to do this with zinc casting. So I'll explain how we do that. So I already showed briefly one of these kind of diagrams. Starting in 1934, 1940, and 1969, there's been an attempt to really track some of these Coptotermes tunnels, see how are they going under the ground, how deep are they going, what do their tunnels look like, how many branches are there, and where are they moving away from their nest as they're foraging. This is the one I showed along the Calcasieu River. This is extremely tedious. This is a pretty big scale that they were able to track. This is 30 feet across the scale bar here. So they were really able to go a long ways tracking these tunnels and finding them as they moved. But this is very tedious, not very replicable. You can't do this 10 times and keep moving. And they're certainly going to miss any small tunnels that they stop, move away from, or you can't see the tunnel as you go. In a lot of lab research, we also use planar assays. Planar assays are a compromise so that we can visualize their tunneling, but still be able to see them and see them in a semi-natural environment. So these planar arenas are 2 sheets of plexiglass with a spacer, this black part around the outside. We fill it up with sand and allow the termites in there so we can always see them from the top and bottom as they're not able to tunnel further away from view. So you can see this time-lapse video rolling here as these termites tunneling their way through the plate. So this has been used to investigate all sorts of things in the literature, mechanics of tunneling, environmental factors on tunneling, how humidity affects it, termiticide efficacy if they're foraging into a zone that is treated, and many more studies. So this has really been used, but this lacks that 3-dimensional aspect and lacks the realistic capabilities in the field. Metal casting has commonly been used in ants. We've seen many subterranean termite ant nests. We're probably familiar with Walter Schinkel in Florida, doing all of these different casts and getting these really cool looks at what's going on under the soil. But we really haven't done this as much with termites. We've done subterranean different nests of termites, looking at their nest structures, and we can understand how the ventilation works to try to model skyscrapers and ventilation systems. But we're not really getting out and seeing where they're foraging outside of this area. There's been very minimal casting of the foraging trails. The previous study used dental plaster, as seen here in kind of an artificial setup, and saw this tunnel network, but this hasn't really been taken outside and done on a larger scale. So our objective was to observe termite tunneling in the field. We've probably seen this figure in different termite trainings where we show these little hotspots or where they're foraging or where they're nesting and subterranean termites. They could be nesting in one place, like the wood pile, and then foraging on the roots of this tree over here and into the house in this area and other resources around the yard. But we don't always show kind of what these simple lines show. We know they're in one place and another. We can prove this with genetic tools or mark release recapture like Carrie talked about, but we don't really know exactly what's going on in this kind of connecting part. With this study, we also wanted to compare our tunnel network for recently discovered resources and compare that to more well-established resources. Do they have exploratory tunnels at one spot, and then after they find food, do they reinforce it into a major highway? We set this up with a pilot study. We basically created a raised above ground sandbox. We put this wall up around that area. We knew this was a very heavily infested area for Formosan termites. And then we filled about 8 or so inches of sand above the ground here. Initially, we were trying to try out some foundations, and we put in these metal bait stations. So we needed to pour molten metal into them, so we didn't want them to just melt away like a plastic bait station would. So we made some different designs of bait stations that we were able to pour our zinc into. Our first run went pretty well. This is Sean from our group with his melted zinc in a crucible pot here that he's pouring into the ground. We tried to devise some funnels to help kind of get some pressure moving in, but we didn't pull it out fast enough, and the metal cooled down, and we couldn't get that funnel out, still stuck in that piece. But when we dug it out of the ground, it worked. So this is a piece that we dug out of the ground that was connected to the bottom of one of our metal bait stations. You can see they go down and then they forage at different areas. Our problem was that this was such a shallow area that as soon as they hit that ground level, they used that as a plane and foraged right along there. You can see even if you zoom in close, there's dead termites still in here and lots of kind of bump ripple effects on this. So this is an example of one of those bait stations that we pulled out. I flipped the picture upside down so that it's sitting on the floor upside down, but it makes a little more sense in this orientation. So this cool area on the top of the surface is some of that zinc that's spread out around the hole. And then you can see all of these tunnels spreading out in different directions and connecting all over. Some of the ones that are brown, we just didn't scrape all the mud off, but there is a piece of metal going straight through there. So our initial study was really good. We had great lateral spread up to about 18 inches. So it moved out 18 inches away from that bait station. And we had multiple connections to bait stations. Even though we only had a small number of pores and bait stations, we had connections between them, which was very exciting. We found in general, it seemed like they tunneled kind of straight down from a resource. This could have to do with the sandbox, as we had it set up where they might be drying out more in this above ground sand. But they tended to come straight out of the bottom of the bait station and go down with some of these tunnels. So our initial lesson learned from this kind of preliminary study, the soil horizon impacted foraging more than we expected. Putting this sand on top of the sod and dirt there didn't really give a very realistic view as well. So we really need to remove that soil and refill with sand before doing. And to get better connectivity, we needed more pore locations. And to get more pore locations, we needed more entry points. So we needed essentially more bait stations or more stakes or something in the ground that we can access them. So after we found that this worked, we kind of got the green light to get out the bigger tools and go forward with this. So now we worked to build this in-ground sandbox. We got out the big tractor, dug that top layer of soil down about 60 centimeters and refilled this whole area with sand. This is still artificial, putting them in a sandbox instead of in the dirt, but this made it a lot easier to dig out at the end, then cut down on some of those obstructions like roots and rocks. They are known from previous studies to follow along as they tunnel along. This is what this sandbox looked like. So we dug this whole area out and then refilled this in with sand. We came back in May, which was last spring, we ran this study. And we installed these wooden stakes about a foot apart. So you can see this large grid of stakes, and now they're only 1 foot apart. So if we pour into one, it's very likely it's going to hit the next one if they're present. We put in a total of 182 stakes. Our goal was to see, if we tracked these week after week, we could see how long that station had been hit to get an idea of how stable they were in that station and compare those tunnel networks between them. We checked these plots weekly. We put a big piece of wood going across this that we moved to different areas so we could stand on this plank, distributing our weight without impacting the sand that we were stepping on. We collected samples for future colony fingerprinting. We can run these to confirm it's all one colony. We always saw those Formosan soldiers coming out, and this is an area with abundant Formosan termites. And then we marked each of the stakes. So we spray painted the top kind of an orange color so that we knew not to disturb it. So we didn't want to keep pulling that stake out every week until we wrecked it and were able to pour the zinc. Just kind of showing our progress. So on April 18th, we got the tractor out, dug this out, refilled with sand. About a month later, May 13th, we added the grid to allow them to kind of settle into this new plot. Initially, there were many hits. So you can see even that first month it went to, our first check, it was 40% of our stations were hit. And then there was kind of a slow addition. The summers here are very hot. I'm very envious of the cooler temperatures and weather that were described there in the beginning of the talk. We're still in that hot kind of summer weather. It still hasn't cooled down. And as that goes, these termites aren't hitting as many new stations. So because of this, we really wanted to make sure we had enough new and old stations so we could compare stations that were brand new hits and stations that were older hits. So we installed auxiliary stations along each of the columns between each of the stakes, making our spacing now 6 inches. So you can see all those light colored ones were just added. The dark ones had been there for longer and aged in the woods. So now we add in this kind of blue line, that is our percent of active stations. And so you can see after installing it, it shot up as well very fast. So we had a lot of them hit initially. Our original stakes that were there for about 3 months had 77% hit rate. Our auxiliary stakes that were only there for 2 weeks at this point had a 63% hit rate. So there's a lot of termite activity in this area. So finally, we made it to casting day. So this was just about a year ago, August 15th of last year. This was our big casting day. So we went out there for our casting. We set up these flamethrowers powered by propane so we can melt down all of this zinc. It takes some time. It was very miserable here in August of last summer. We had heat advisories and we were out there and, having to have full PPE once we were pouring this. And it was really a lot of heat and a lot of work, but it was very worth it as this was the time when these termites are most active. So you can see we have the zinc melting here in the middle, kind of stir it and get it ready to then pour into these areas. So I have a video here showing us pouring these in. So we're going along, pulling out a stake at a time. So I'll pull the next stake, checking for termite activity. If there are termites active on the stake, we go ahead and pour zinc into that hole. If there's no termite activity, then they weren't in that stake and we didn't bother to pour into that hole. But we just continue going down the line, pulling out stakes and pouring that into the ground. And you can see it kind of bubbling up and steaming there in the ground as this moves its way into the tunnels, fills out up to that kind of 18 inches away from it. This is kind of the aftermath. This is what it looked like after that first pour. So we started in the middle, began to pouring in all of these ones. We used that plank to kind of help walk out there without destroying the plot. But you can see where that tank with the melted zinc in really kind of scars that board. So it's very, very hot temperatures we're working with. As you can see, it scarred the board charted there. Next came excavation. We poured it one day and waited until the next day to come back. For me, I was very excited to see what was out there. We poured all of these in the ground and then just left it to cool because we needed that zinc to cool down before we started digging in. So it was almost kind of like a Christmas morning feel where you get to go out there and uncover all of these stations that were out there. So we poured molten zinc into 39 stake holes that we pulled out. 23 were successful pours where they actually did spread into the tunnels. 16 were islands where they didn't follow the tunnels that were present in there. The soil sometimes collapsed when you pulled the stake out. So you pulled the stake out and everything collapsed in. Then you couldn't really pour the zinc into those tunnels. Also, sometimes the soil caked on the stake and was kind of destroying that tunnel system before we were able to pour into it. But this is a view of kind of what it looks like. This is at ground level, looking at all these stakes coming in. You can see some feet up here on the ground above. But these are some of those tunnels coming out, moving around. And so once we had everything exposed, you can see all of these tunnels connecting things together. Some of these wooden stakes that are in there, the zinc actually came in from another pour, filled into that void inside of the stake where the termites were feeding, and it was kind of stuck into the system there. So we left those in. So we pulled all these out of the ground and brought them into our building nearby. We used molding clay to hold these all upright and then tried to kind of prop them up at different levels so we could really look at this first in an air-conditioned space that's still very, very hot outside. And second, where we were able to take measurements and really get close to how these were looking in the ground. Just an example of kind of packing that molding clay to make these help stand up. So the first most striking result that was really surprising to me, I guess I shouldn't have been too surprised if I had really followed along in the literature and thought about it, but I expected these tunnels to be circular. And instead of being circular, they're much more oval and kind of ribbon-like. If you take a cross section, it looks a lot more like a ribbon going along there. If it was circular, you wouldn't have any termites walking on every outside surface of the circle. There'd be a big dead space in the middle where nobody could walk because there's nothing to hold on to. So you'd have this big gap or big airspace that's kind of a waste of space. With a ribbon, there's always an edge that you can go on and you're never going to leave that gap. The same shape was found in the previous pouring with dental plaster. And while we had to melt down our zinc to pour it, the dental plaster didn't involve heat. So this isn't just a fact that this strong heat came through and melted the tunnels down into the shape. This is actually the shape that these tunnels really were. So in the lab, we took measurements of all of these tunnels, the widths and the height, to try to get an idea of how these tunnels were. And so we measured all the tunnels coming out of our pores from about 1 centimeter from the pore location. And we found that, as you would expect, as tunnel width increases, so does tunnel height. However, we started to measure some of these larger ones, and we found that with the addition of these larger tunnels, this relationship is not really linear anymore. We have a lot more kind of outliers on the bottom here and on the top here, so we're seeing more of a curve. So if we transform our data, we're seeing more of this kind of logistic relationship between tunnel width and tunnel height. So in other words, the tunnel height will max out as the tunnel width increases. So the tunnels can keep getting wider and wider, but we're only going to get so tall because there's kind of an infinite set that you can get to. There are a variety of different size tunnels. Some of them were very narrow, almost just a single termite could go down at a time. And some of them were more like major highways where you could have tons and tons of termites going through this area. We also found some were more smooth and some were more textured. So some of the ones, there seemed to be a pattern where the tunnels were bumpy in texture when they were going vertically, going up and down. These tunnels were very bumpy. And the ones going more laterally or, left to right were more smooth. And so this may be like a spiral staircase of sorts where instead of being able to go straight down, they would slide down if this wall was too smooth. They have this way of moving around this bumpy pattern. This has been seen in some of the ant pores where they have a spiral staircase where the tunnels are corkscrewing in this way so you can walk up them without having to climb a sheer edge. We found a lot of intersections. Our largest intersection we uncovered had 5 tunnels with a single one going downward. So this is that downward tunnel coming straight out of the bottom. Our maximum width of this intersection was almost 30 centimeters, and the maximum height was kind of that maxed out 4.7 millimeters. These are also kind of some of these crazy tunnels that we found. So this is just an example of some of these intersections that are going in multiple dimensions. So again, when we see it in a plate or, in the lab, we kind of miss the ability for some of these more complicated structures to be formed. So tunnel establishment over time. So we wanted to have something that was, an easy question to say, as they establish in a resource, they make bigger tunnels or they make more tunnels, kind of have more connectivity to resources. Unfortunately, we didn't find this pattern. So when we compared our newly discovered stakes to our more established stakes, they had about the same number of connecting tunnels. So we thought, maybe, they still have the same number of tunnels, but they're bigger tunnels. So maybe they reinforce and make these major highways. And unfortunately, if we take those measurements and calculate out the area of that oval tunnel, pi times half the width times half the height, we had no difference again. So there's the same amount of millimeter squared space that's connecting to each of these ones. So why isn't this different? So this is what we're thinking. In the future, we're going to have to put stakes out. We've done some of this. We haven't quite finished all of the analysis up, but put stakes out and recollect them just within days, because as soon as they discover these tunnels, they establish this tunnel network, and this giant colony can make them just like the ones that have been established for much longer time. We also found some really cool pinch points. So this is some of these previous studies of planar assays, looking at these colonies in something that's even as big as a 1 by 1 meter planar assay here. They might have these pinch points that allow something like reticulotermes, which has a really low soldier ratio. When you collect reticulotermes, you don't find soldiers very often. They use these pinch points to make the most of their soldiers. So they might not have many soldiers, but they might use them in these strategic locations to protect the colony. We found some of these pinch points. This is the same pinch point present when it was out in the dirt compared to in the building, where it seemed like this tunnel starts off at a decent width and then narrows down to a single termite width before branching back out. This is where our zinc melt cooled and no longer was able to keep going. But you can see it's still kind of that blunt end, which is what we see at the end of pores, not a little narrowed constriction point. Formosan subterranean termites with so many soldiers have these pinch points. Maybe it's still a part of their nest where they have these little areas that kind of prevent some of the traffic if they're getting invaded by ants or other predators. It might be for defensibility. It might be a new connection point, or there might have been some kind of physical obstruction of a root or something that they weren't able to make their way through. We also saw active branching. So there's been a lot of studies in plates before that looks at kind of the progress of how they make a side branch. And so when the traffic in the tunnel gets too intense, or they're waiting too long to go and pick up at the end of the tunnel, they begin to build these side tunnels. And they found in planar assays that they usually were at about a 90-degree angle. So they'll build these side tunnels straight off the side. We found these kind of flag structures in some of our areas that looked a lot like the start of a new tunnel coming off. So this is a tunnel going along, and then there is this little triangular flag underground. So our guess is that this is a newly formed tunnel. But this really shows that this tunnel behavior is accurately simulated in planar arenas. So a lot of what we've seen previously in lab studies is very relatable to what we see in the field. If we kind of superimpose this over what we see in the top part here, this lines up just right. You have the tunnel going along, and then you have the start of a tunnel kind of flag branching off with this triangular side piece. Our future plans, so we started on some of these, but we haven't had as much time this year to really devote to this. So we only did this small portion of the plot. We had the rest of it present. We came back later and added additional stakes and then did a pour in January. We still are working on excavating it all and working through that data, but we want to return and finish this plot and continue more plots in the future. And we also want to branch out and try to do this in soil. So we did this in sand for the ease of being able to excavate and really simulate, but we want to test this in natural soil environments. For this project, we had many people to thank, particularly Sean, who was able to don up this very extensive PPE and a heat advisory in the middle of August in New Orleans. But this was a lot of work to melt the zinc and dig these tunnels and prepare the plot. So there's a lot of people who helped with this. With that, I think we're ready for questions. I wanted to share a couple of my favorite Mardi Gras floats here from our Muses Parade a couple of years ago that had an insect festival. That was a tented termite house as the float with an exterminator on the front, as well as Rochella with lots of cockroaches. This was themed different festivals. Again, our contact info is here. If you have any questions, feel free to reach out and be sure to follow us on social media. We have lots of webinars that we host as well and lots of free material for education and different things on there.
Good stuff, Mark. Hey, while we're going through the questions for both you and Carrie, put that QR code back up. So if people want to get involved in the NATS program, we have people from Tennessee, Georgia, North and South Carolina, and Pennsylvania online right now. So if you're interested in participating in that, folks, and you want to add some of your observations on where you found termites and what they were, it's not just for Formosan termites, it's all termites. Scan that thing and you'll get to be involved in this North American termite survey. So that was really cool stuff, Mark. So you're going to continue and do the rest of that plot? When will you do that? Is that this year?
Yeah, we started with it and then we got a little distracted. We had a snowstorm and a symposium. It's always something keeping us busy here. So we've poured the zinc in there. We still need to pull that out and do all of the measurements. So we've gotten some of it out. But yeah, we're doing that. And then we want to start another plot and probably have it ready to go next summer so we can really catch that time when they're really digging tunnels.
Yeah. I had a different question. This goes back to some of the stuff that Carrie talked about as well. It seems that in stuff that you did in the barracks and Carrie did as well, what is it about flavipes that allows it to hang around? You have these remnant populations of flavipes that they're a little blue dot or a little red dot somewhere in a sea of Formosan termites. So how does flavipes, do they expand when you baited all the Formosan termites out of the park? Did you see an expansion of flavipes, or what is it about? What is it about the termite that allows them to hang on?
I don't really know. We didn't see them expand their foraging territories like we do with Formosan termites. A Formosan colony will just explode in the space that it's taking up. I think a lot of them have been outcompeted, outnumbered. Their soldier ratio is lower. Their colony numbers are smaller. But these last hanging on remnants, I don't really know. I don't have a good answer for that. Maybe Mark has some insight.
Yeah, I think you're right. They're maybe using a slight different resource and kind of going undetected until that Formosan colony comes in and knocks them out. So it's just kind of, can they pop up in different places and stick around long enough until that Formosan colony finds them and probably outcompetes them in that area. Yeah.
There's a question here by somebody for you, Mark. It says, when you get a pinch point of a large tube, was there an elevation change up or down? Did you notice?
So we only found the one. So I was kind of showing these are preliminary results where it's not of replications, but it was on a slight angle. But I don't know. Yeah, that could be some way of keeping, if water's flowing in, you could keep the water from flowing if you could shut the tunnel down if rain's coming in through the soil.
And this is a question for Carrie. And if there's any other questions that people want to pipe in, put them in the chat or in the Q&A thing here. So Carrie, are you allowed to use liquids in the quarter, or because of the water table? Do you have any idea how many operators in the New Orleans area use liquids, especially fipronil?
Yeah, a lot. Most companies that you come across in New Orleans will give their customer an option to do either a liquid perimeter treatment or a treatment of bait stations around a property. We still do pre-treats with fipronil. There are some companies that will do both. It's not necessary, but they'll do both a perimeter treatment and then they'll put bait stations in the ground around that perimeter treatment. Not the greatest thing to do, because if you have too many termites dying within that, where that fipronil treatment is, you're not going to get very many hits on your bait stations. But yeah, people do use liquid treatments in the French Quarter. I mean, our water table is high, but it's a 4 by 6 inch trench. So it's.
I have a comment
so
here.
both-
I had a comment here from somebody who said if they get a chance, they need to go out to see the unit there in New Orleans.
We'll be happy to have you. But I tell you,
he's been twice before when he was with the Department of Ag, but he's
all I ask is that you let us know in advance, because our schedules are a little bit crazy and we have a lot of irons in the fire, but let us know you're coming and we will give you a full tour.
Yeah, absolutely. Don't just drop in. Everybody's busy. But I happen to know that they'd be happy to show you around.
Yes.
Really
absolutely.
unique. I've got somebody on here that also commented about how unique your unit is, and they want to know whether there's any other group like this in the country. And I don't think so.
No.
Not even close.
No, there's plenty of mosquito abatement districts in the country, but even then they don't do everything that we do. We do rodent control, termite control, general pest control.
Did the mosquito concentration, was that a result of Katrina? Because I know, talk a little bit about the swimming pool issue you had after Katrina and mosquito problems that came from that.
So there were, I mean, anytime there's any kind of weather event, within 7 days, we have boots on the ground. Most times it's within 3 days. We're out looking and surveying the area for increased sources for mosquito breeding areas. So after Katrina, we were using the gambusia fish, putting those in people's swimming pools until they could get back home and start treating the pools. They would eat the mosquito larvae that was in there because, nobody had power for months on end. Your pool filter is not going to be running. It was really, really a swampy mess.
Yeah.
But we soon realized, hey, this flood water, if it brings fish into these pools from flooding, there's no mosquitoes in there. Who'd have thunk it? So we started feeding some of these fish into pools to feed on the mosquito larvae. And we're coming up on the 20-year anniversary. I'm already oh my gosh, 20-year anniversary.
Oh boy, it's crazy, isn't it? There's going to be some cool stuff talking about rodents and mosquitoes topic coming up from your same group with Jana McAllister and Tim Adair coming up in December. So everybody needs to come back later on this fall and hear about the tremendous rodent issues. They were in the news just the other day. What other questions do we have, folks? This was a really, y'all have so much going on out there. So it's really, and the ant stuff. I mean, I know that you do a lot of ant work out there too, and you have such a great diversity in Louisiana, your ant fauna.
I tell you what, anytime you travel, if you work in pest control, get your restaurant recommendations from other pest control people that are in the industry. I do.
Oh yeah. Yeah.
After Timmy's talk, he'll probably rule out a lot of the places downtown. So be
most
careful.
of us can smell it anyway. And maybe that's why you have such area. You can eat outside. So
I tell you what, the pest control industry has I don't look at things the way that I used to.
Yeah.
If I go to somebody's house, I don't notice how it's decorated or high ceilings or if the landscaping's fresh. I'm like, can you see the slab all the way around the house? Oh, great. You just had spray foam insulation put in your attic. Good for you, I guess.
You're looking for rub marks and
yeah, looking for rub marks and knowing that spray foam insulation termites can tunnel right through it and stay hidden and secure hiding.
Entomologists are kind of geeky that way. Here's another question that came in, Carrie. Have you ever experienced any bait station aversion or stations that were hit but abandoned by the termites? I mean, it's pretty common in retics.
Yeah, in retics, that can be common, not so much with Formosan.
Yeah.
Like I said, if bait stations are placed too close to where a perimeter liquid treatment would have been done, those stations aren't going to get hit. They need to be put several feet away from where that fipronil is put down. But you really don't need both. It's really kind of an either or.
Yeah, getting a lot of comments here about the great presentation. So I want to thank you both.
Oh, no, thank you.
I think for a warm August day to get 320 people to come look at a webinar is pretty remarkable. So
That's really impressive.
it is, because it's bug killing time. And,
I know.
and here in Georgia, we just had our registration date was just a couple months ago. So usually people put it off till the very end, but and we got 2 more years to do that, but a lot of interest in this topic. So we thank you both, and thank everybody for attending. Join us next. This was a wood destroying organism webinar. I think next month we're doing pest control, and I think it might be bed bugs. So join us. And so thanks everybody, and
Thank you.
have a great rest of your week.
All right.
Thanks, Carrie. Thanks, Mark.
Thanks.
Bye.